chapter 13 is where we're going to be camping out. Signs of the times. We're in a series that's going to take several weeks on Wednesday nights. We're calling it The End, kind of a morbid title, but it's a study in eschatology. And if you'll remember, I'm going to give kind of a quick review of some of the things we covered last week and bring us up to the point where we're going to finish off our outline from last week. But eschatology is just that. It is a study of the end. Esket is a root term that essentially means just that, end, and ology, study of. So this is a study of the end. Hence the name of the overarching series called The End. And for this week and next week, and possibly even the week after, we're going to be still camping out in Mark chapter 13. I told you guys that I did not want to rush through this. I wanted to take time, answer questions, and get a lot out of this. But now I'm not going to camp out or grow stagnant in one area just for the sake of just staying in one spot. But we're looking at signs of the times. And more specifically, we're looking at signs of the times that Jesus outlined in Mark chapter 13 to kind of give us direction, and he begins to unfold what will be the things that will ultimately lead to the end of days, as Joel will call it. The prophet Joel tells us to cry loud in Zion in Joel chapter 2. And I think that is the prophet's way of admonishing us that we should get the word out. If Jesus wanted to take time to tell us that the time is coming and you need to watch for certain things, I think that if Jesus gives us a direct order, we would do well to follow what Jesus says. And with all of that being said, I know that this same stuff has been taught and said for decades, really hundreds of years. I mean, we get a glimpse of a little something and we say, oh, that's it. You know, it's right around the corner. And, you know, a lot of people will argue, well, people have been saying that for years and years and years. And I will agree with you 100% they have. This same stuff's been taught for literally centuries now. And every generation has seemingly an event or a series of events that feels like the end. And I say all that to say, I agree. It has been taught and it has felt like that. But Jesus would tell us, even in Mark chapter 13, he said, these will be the beginning of birth pains. And I've been in the delivery room and I've been around that a couple of times. And I'll tell you straight up, the closer it comes time for the baby to be born, the more frequent and the more painful the birth pains become. And even though this has been taught for hundreds of years, can I just say this? I can't tell you that it's going to happen tomorrow. I can't tell you that it's going to happen next week or next year. But I can tell you it's never hurt like this before. And it's never hurt this frequently before. And if Jesus' teaching about the end will teach us anything, we're closer than we've ever been. I mean, just look at 2015. I mean, with everything that happened in just last year, what is 2016? Here we are, February of 2016. We're 2 months in, a sixth of the way into this year, not even really a full sixth of the way. We're 2 months into this year. What does this year hold? Well, I'll tell you what it holds. I'll tell you what's coming this year. If this year is anything like last year and the birth pains get closer and closer and closer, I can't help but see Jesus coming. Now, I'm not saying that he's coming in 2016. Don't go around and say, John said he's coming in 2016. I'm telling you, the birth pains are getting more frequent. They're getting more severe. And Jesus says, when you see that happening, I'm on my way. So with all of that being said, let's look at this. I'm going to read Mark 1 through 13, verse 1 through 4 very quickly, and then we're going to just kind of give a quick play-by-play of where we covered last time, and then pick up with the areas that we've left off. Mark chapter 13, beginning in verse 1. Then as he went out of the temple, this is Jesus, as Jesus went out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, Teacher, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here. And Jesus answered and said to him, Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. We've already seen that come to pass. Now as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of all the things, what will be the sign when all these things will be fulfilled? You got to see this is a twofold question. One, when will these things be? And what will be the signs when all these things will be fulfilled? When will this happen? And what are the signs leading up to it happening? That's where we pick up in verse 5. Verse 5 and 6, read these very quickly. Jesus answering them began to say, Take heed that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name saying, I am he, and will deceive many. Religious deception. Religious deception. And we've seen this float around in so many different ways, with even the leader of the largest, if you want to call it, denomination of the Christian faith. I don't know if that's the right term. Even getting into some very sketchy areas with other religions and pointing towards the fact that perhaps even these other religions are worshiping the same God as the God of the Bible. I'm telling you, religious deception at its core. This is universalism, is what it is. And universalism is, it's a direct heresy to the teachings of the Orthodox Church at all. Not only that, you leave even the Catholic, mainstream Catholicism and get in even to Protestant teachings and beliefs. I mean, you see this prosperity gospel, and I use the term gospel very loosely when I attach it to the term prosperity, because I don't see where there's a true good news gospel to the prosperity teaching. Now, it feels good, it sounds good, it talks good, but when you're sitting down balancing your checkbook and all of a sudden it isn't happening, all of a sudden it's not good. Or when you're sitting in the hospital with your child or your spouse, or even if it's yourself in the hospital bed, and this prosperity gospel that you've been taught is not coming through, all of a sudden the good news isn't good news. If you want to call prosperity gospel good news. Instead, I believe that the good news of the gospel is no matter what we go through, Jesus is there, and Jesus is enough. So, religious deception. Verses 7 and 8. But when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, don't be troubled, for such things must happen, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And then he goes on and talks about, and there will be earthquakes in various places, and there will be famines and troubles, and these are the beginnings of birth pains. These are the beginning of it all. Religious deception. Secondly, escalated wars and increased human suffering. Increased human suffering. Do you realize that across the globe today, just in children alone will die of curable disease and starvation check this out, that you could eradicate the entire population of Whitfield County in 3 days. With the number of kids that will die each day. Take 3 days just in children. It would sum up and probably exceed the number of the population of this entire county in 3 days. Just with curable disease and starvation. Currently, the United States is engaged in 74 nations around the globe where the U.S. is fighting or helping some force in some proxy struggle that has been deemed beneficial to our nation. 74 places in the world, our country alone is engaged in battle or some kind of struggle, conflict around the world, wars and rumors of wars. I mean, you see this coming alive right before our eyes. In the last decade alone, we've had the 3 largest recorded storms on record. Hurricane Katrina, Superstorm Sandy, just this year, Winter Storm Juno. It's right before us. Jesus would say that there will be famines and plagues and earthquakes. How about the tsunamis that have hit the Indonesia area and even Japan that were stemmed by some major earthquakes out to sea? I mean, this is just coming to fruition. And we've seen that just in the last couple of years. And it just seems to be coming more frequently and more frequently and more frequently. And, you know, I know these gloom and doom prophets that kind of guise themselves as the Discovery Channel sometimes they've got some pretty hard science, but they talk about that Yellowstone National Park is a volcanic cauldron in and of itself. It's what they call a super volcano that is scheduled to erupt at any time. That a volcano of this size would drastically reduce the temperature of this planet. It would wipe out at least a third of the United States with direct explosion or fallout related to that. It'd be equivalent to several megaton nuclear blasts that would be set off in the northeast of this country. Essentially, the bread belt of our nation would be unusable for decades. I mean, and isn't this exactly what Jesus is talking about? He said not only would there be wars and rumors of wars, but it's going to seem like the earth itself is just heaving with distress, almost as if the rock that God formed and put people on in His image. It's almost like even the rock knows. Oh, wait a second. That sounds a whole lot like what Jesus said about worship, doesn't it? He says, listen, if you're not willing to worship, listen, even the rocks know to worship. They'll cry out in your place if you're not careful. So we see escalated wars and increased human suffering. Picking up in verse 9. But watch out for yourselves, for they will deliver you up to councils, governmental authorities, and you will be beaten in synagogues. Listen, religious authorities. And you will be brought before rulers and kings for my sake, for a testimony to them. And the gospel must first be preached to all the nations. But when they arrest you and deliver you up, do not worry beforehand or premeditate what you will speak. But whatever is given to you in that hour, speak that. For it is not you who speak, but it is the Holy Spirit. Religious deception, escalated wars, and increased human suffering. Thirdly, believers forced to identify themselves. You don't believe this is happening? Let's take, for example, this mark. This mark is called a noon or an in as we would understand it in Arabic. It means Nasrani. It is a derogatory term. It literally means Nazarene. This is what several of the Arabs are using to mark the homes of Christians in these areas. They will use this term Nasrani, Nazarene, as a derogatory statement to mark Christians. This isn't nothing new. As Christians, we are familiar with this even in our own history. I mean, the term Christian was originally a derogatory statement. It was meant to mark those that believed in Christ, and it was used first in Antioch to make fun of those believers in Antioch. You can find that in the book of Acts. This term Nasrani, Jesus was a Nazarene. They're talking about the Nazarene, and they're marking homes to force believers to identify themselves. Rogue brigades coming through the areas after a long day of battle may see this term and will go in and raid and kill and rape those that are inside and steal from them because they believe that the infidels in this home have absolutely no rights. I saw something just recently that they say, people want to say, that's radical Islam. What about all these radical Christians? Well, let's compare the two. Can we compare the two very quickly? Radical Islam says if you don't believe, you will give your life. Radical Christianity says even if it costs me my life, I'm going to tell you the truth. Do you see the stark difference between the two? One says kill, the other one says I'm willing to die for you. And so we have believers forced to identify themselves. A time is coming and is already here when Christians will increasingly be forced to identify themselves and show their allegiances. Let me take you back to just a few months ago. In San Bernardino, wasn't it? When people were asked, "Are you a Christian?" And if the answer was yes, they were shot. Let me take you back to just a few months earlier than that. Wasn't it in Colorado that the same thing happened? How about in Columbine back in 91? I think it was in the 90s. The Columbine Massacre. It wasn't 91 because I was in high school when it happened. 17 years ago. 98. 99. Yeah. Special coming on. Think about it. Forced to align themselves with Christianity. Do you picture the guys in the orange jumpsuits in Egypt lining the coast of the beach, blindfolded, with a guy with a machete walking down the line behind them, saying, "Do you renounce Jesus? Do you pledge your allegiance to Muhammad and Allah?" And if they would say Jesus is the Lord of their lives, their heads are chopped off. Can I ask you real quickly? What about the second guy who was asked that question? I'm not saying the first guy didn't have a lot of nerve. But what about the second guy? Or the third? Who would say that Jesus is my all in all? Believers forced to identify themselves. Well, church, that's listen, 10 years ago, 15 years ago when I got into ministry, and I would possibly teach or preach about end-time prophecies, I would always teach and preach about martyrs in Africa and in the Middle East and in China? 10, 15 years ago, just a short amount of time ago, it was foreign to say that there will be martyrs in the United States. It's here. It's here. In 2014, Houston Mayor Anise Parker issued orders for pastors to submit their sermons under the guise of HERO, Houston Equal Rights Ordinance Law. Forcing ministers to submit their sermons so that they can be reviewed and churches possibly fined for hate speech speaking out against homosexuality. That's just 2 years ago, folks. In this country, believers forced to identify themselves. Ministers are made to have sermon notes pre-approved by governing officials. Believers are called out during violent attacks. Churches will be emptied as those who worship Christ will be put under pressure to conform. Mark my words. This is going to happen. Let me say it a different way. This is happening. Here's what you're going to see, and you're going to see over the next several years and maybe even sooner, you're going to see, before I get into that, let's read verse 12, and then we'll come back. We're going to catch a few things that I want to point out, but we've got to catch verse 12 to do it. And it says this, verse 12, "Now brother will betray brother to death, and father his child, and children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But he who endures to the end shall be saved." I've said this last week, I'll say it again. I would encourage you to, as we point out these places, Jesus, you'll see all the way through this, Jesus is giving little tidbits of encouragement for believers. Along the way, he'll say things like, he who endures unto the end will be saved. He would say, don't be troubled, and these are just the beginning. Watch out for yourselves. He's going to give kind of little tidbits of encouragement along the way to try to encourage believers. He'll say, don't worry beforehand or premeditate what you're going to say. And he's going to go into this. So not only do we got religious deception, escalated wars, and increased human suffering, believers forced to identify themselves, but we're going to have wholesale defection and betrayal by apostate believers. Families are turning against family, brother against brother, sister against sister, friend against friend. Those who have made salvation easy and have Christianity without Christ will fall away. You'll see this happening. I've got a friend of mine. I've shared this to a small degree before. I baptized this young man. I spent countless numbers of hours trying to disciple this young guy who has completely turned his life away from Christ, delved into an alternative lifestyle, and almost refuses to speak to me or my family at all because he knows where we stand. Wholesale defection and betrayal by apostate believers. Can you picture yourself living in this house? Let's put yourself in the shoes of someone who is not a believer, and you live in the Middle East, and you come home and you see this painted on your fence, and inside is your brother, your sister, your parents, but yet your family lives there. And you're not a Christian, but they are. And you know this sign means that at any moment somebody could come in and bust through your door. And they're not going to take time to ask questions. They're just going to start their rampage in your house. Brother will turn against brother and put them out. Sister against sister, father against son, son against father. It's happening. It's happening right now. Yes. There was a story, and I hesitated even sharing this. I thought about sharing it. I didn't do the homework enough to find out. I was told this at a conference a couple of years ago that I was at, that I want to say it was in Michigan, an Islamic father sitting across the table from his daughter, who claimed she essentially came to her family and said that she's accepted Jesus as the Lord of her life, instituted Sharia law right there in his own house, and shot her in the head across the table in this country. I mean, it's here. Wholesale defection and betrayal by believers. Let's say you leave today, and by some law that is passed, or you find yourself in a particular situation that happens, and you are like those Egyptian Christians, you found yourself kneeling somewhere blindfolded with an executioner coming down the line asking, do you believe in Jesus? Cassie Bernal, the young lady at Columbine High School in the 90s, staring down the barrel of a gun, was asked the simple question, do you believe? Do you believe? Am I the only one in the room who's contemplated that moment? Who's thought, what would I do? I've got a wife and kids. I've got a family. I've got people I love. I've got people that count on me. Not only that, let's just tell the complete truth. If God says it's my time, He'll take me on home, but I'm in no hurry to check out. Has anyone else in the room thought about, I don't know what I would do in that moment? Have we even toyed with grace for just a moment and said, you know what, I can say this, but it would just be a lie, and I can afford a lie, and I can come back, and God under His grace would understand my circumstance and would forgive me for that lie. And I know that I can just count on the grace of Jesus Christ. But what does Jesus say? It's very interesting, and I have read this verse over and over and over again, but I believe 100% that this is what Jesus is talking about when He says in verse 11, but when they arrest you and deliver you up, He says, don't worry beforehand or premeditate what you're going to say. But whatever is given to you in that hour, speak that, because it's not you who is speaking, but it's the Holy Spirit that's speaking through you. I think in that moment we would be surprised to hear our mouths say that Jesus is the Lord of our lives. And I think the surprise will come in the fact that there is nothing in John that would say that in that moment. I hope you don't think less of me. But I tell you that in that moment, I'm afraid that I would not have the strength. I would hope that I would. But I believe Jesus is saying, don't worry about it. I've got this. Through the power of my Holy Spirit in your life, I've got this. Don't worry about it. Don't premeditate about it. Don't think about it beforehand, because I'll talk through you in that moment. That second guy, that third guy on that beach, I bet before it happened, he thought, the same thing that you and I have toyed with, grace, grace, grace. And he opens his mouth and the Spirit of the Lord begins to speak through him in that moment. And just in the blink of an eye, he is standing before the one that he professed as the Lord of his life. Wholesale defection and betrayal by apostate believers. Number 5, the gospel is preached to every nation. I've got just a few moments, and I want to get through this. Let's look back at Mark 13:10 again, and this is what the gospel says. Jesus says this, and the gospel must first be preached to all the nations. The good news of Jesus Christ has spread across this globe, and the message is going out, and the opportunity for salvation is coming to an end. Who do you need to share the gospel with this week? On average, the combined efforts of evangelical organizations, the gospel touches the term here, nations, is the Greek word ethnos. And we can argue ethnicities and small pockets with different dialects and how we're translating the Bible even to reach those dialects. But the truth is we have touched and touch every ethnos of the world every 7 years as a whole. Every 7 years for the past, I believe it was last 50 years, so you can do the math, we have preached the gospel around this globe multiple times, about every 7 years through the combined efforts, and this isn't counting other organizations. This is just evangelical organizations such as the North American Mission Board and the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the North American Mission Board is part of that, and the IMB, David Platt is president of the International Mission Board, places like that are organizing group efforts. We are preaching the gospel to the entire world about every 7 years. Jesus says the gospel must be first preached to the entire world. It's happened. It's happened time and time again at this point. Not only that, through the old invention of radio, and the newer inventions of television, and even the newest invention of satellite television and satellite radio, the gospel is getting out in a more frequent pace. I mean, we're only counting every 7 years that we're actually able to send missions organizations to each ethnos. That's not counting all of these that are getting the gospel through technology, through the internet, through radio, through television. I mean, just think about it. The gospel is already being preached. Listen, we're halfway through what Jesus says will be the signs of the end of days. And we're already seeing this stuff has happened. It's happened already. The question is, are we ready? And are we doing everything we can to make sure that Jesus will say it this way. Jesus will say, go into all the world. Greg Laurie out of Washington would say it this way. He would say, let me personalize that for you. Go into all of your world and preach the gospel. Go into all the world. Go into all of your world and declare the gospel. That is the call of every Christian, is to share the gospel message. Share the gospel message with this entire world. Are you ready? Are you doing everything you can? Remember this past Sunday? I said we've got to live with the notion, the decision of our destination out before us, and everything we're doing. We're doing it to try to reach that destination, and we're keeping that in view with every move that we make. If you keep your destination, if you keep the end in sight, if you keep the fact that heaven is your eternal home, you keep that constantly in view, and everything you do, you want to do it in light of that being in the vision that you have moving forward, then you will be preaching the gospel. It becomes, for Christians, this is not a calling, it is the calling. It is not optional, it is it is 100% something that Jesus has called every believer to do. Every Christian, if a true Christian, they are a missionary. They are a missionary. They are called to share the gospel. So what are you doing? All right, I've got to close. I know I've got 5 minutes. I want to end there, and we'll pick up with the second sheet next week. Anybody got any questions or comments you want to add to tonight's study? Sure. Yes. My answer is, if I'd like to see you add to that question. Is that to the Jews or is it to the Gentiles? And I'm going to say yes to both, but to the Jewish nation first. You'll see. Well, you got to see the abomination of desolation is going to be a sign to the entire world, and you're going to see that there will be people that will be saved even in the tribulation period. So as this is a mark to the Jews that they've got to get moving and they've got to get headed in the right direction, I believe we'll see when we get into Revelation, the 144,000 are going to be the beginning of the evangelical community that's going to help preach Jesus during the tribulation period and see lives changed and souls saved even during the tribulation period. Now, we get into the areas where Jesus says, hey, you're going to have to flee, you're going to have to run. If you're on the housetop, don't even stop to pack your stuff, just go. I believe you're going to see that pointed more to the Jews because a true believer up to that point is going to be out of here. Yeah, it's not to the church. It'll be signed to tribulation believers and to the Jewish nation. And even when I say the Jewish nation, I've even got to drop back and say not to the Messianic Jews, because Messianic Jews are Christians. It's just to the Orthodox Jewish believer and those that will be saved in the tribulation period. So yeah, we'll get into that a little bit more next week. And even I believe it's verse 19, 20, you'll get into, Jesus will talk about this is the tribulation. And this is a lot of the same language that John is going to use in the book of Revelation. Of course, John was one of them that he was talking to at this point. So I think John's taking his pointers from Jesus himself as he gets his revelation as well. Anyone else? Good question. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And they can actually see the cauldron sinking every year. And if cauldron is just what it sounds like. Everybody's familiar with a cauldron that you cook with, a dish shape. At the top of a volcano, the dish shape that would fill in by the packed up magma and debris that closes off, that's what causes the eruption. The pressure gets so heated and so high under that cauldron that it eventually busts through, and that's the big explosion that happens. But they're even seeing in Yellowstone the cauldron sinking, and that is normally indicative. The cauldron will sink as pressure grows higher underneath it. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyone else? Interesting stuff. At least I think it is. I don't know if you guys think it is or not, but I think it's very interesting. All right, well, let's be dismissed in prayer.